Hi there, and welcome to the first Q&A video. I figured I would try and do something a little bit different today and, turn off the YouTube voice and just try and answer some of your questions in a more casual style. So hello, if you haven't seen me before, I am Jasper. I am the creator of NoClip.website and a couple of other videos going over some of Nintendo's graphics tech. And to help me out today, I have brought along a fellow YouTuber. Say hi.
Hello. I'm Scruffy, and I run a YouTube channel where I go over video game audio and audio design and music theory. And it also pertains a lot to Nintendo at this point because there's just so much to talk about there.
So much, yeah. Speaking of, do you want to just get right into it?
Yeah, let's get into it. So let's start with a little bit about what you mentioned, NoClip.
Yeah.
So NoClip.website. If you haven't visited, if you're watching this, please go visit this amazing website. It documents different areas from 3D video games, a lot of them from GameCube and Wii, but not only does it display them, it also displays them as they appear on console, with like animations and lighting and textures as authentic as the web can render it. And it's really quite amazing how all of this has been...
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. You deserve a lot of credit for making this a reality, because not only is it a great reference tool, it also provides like great just backdrops. Like it's a very nostalgic experience going through that website.
Oh yeah.
And seeing all of these areas exactly as they were meant to appear.
I will say, like, backdrops, it's fine. Don't use it as wallpaper engine. I've already got like an angry email about someone whose like computer I apparently overheated if you use it in wallpaper engine.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine.
Or if you do, don't blame me, please. It's like expensive to render 3D graphics like that. So
yeah, because not only is it rendering them, but it's also going through some of the processes that the console went through.
Yeah.
And I suppose we can kick it off there. Like, how exactly is this website working? Like, how are you importing these maps in, and then on top of that, how are you getting the website to support some of these animations and graphics that the GameCube and other consoles supported?
So yeah, I built this sort of thing. It's been a passion project for me for a long time. A few years ago, I said it was like, I looked back at my like screenshots and looked at the timestamps, and it was like 6 years. It's probably a year or more since then. So 7 years that I've been working on, not specifically NoClip, but like these sorts of tools. And it's a completely like custom engine from the ground up that uses like some web technologies to get 3D graphics in there. But more interesting to that, when I was first working on like some of the prototype tools that like came before NoClip, there was one I wrote called the bmdview.js, which, I mean, you can go visit it now. It still kind of works, but it's really slow, and like I had no idea what I was doing when I made it. I originally realized, because I was just like, wait a minute, they're doing so much like that is specific to the GameCube like itself in the file formats. So I realized that I couldn't really just like extract them into like a common format. I really had to like emulate the GameCube as it is in order for like full accuracy. So whenever you're running like NoClip and you open like a GameCube game, it's not like emulating a GameCube per se. It's not like downloading the actual like ROM or anything, but it is downloading the game files as they existed on disk. And I have like a layer that tries to, I mean, it's not like a real emulation layer, but it has to recreate kind of the GameCube GPU and how it works under the hood. Right. So yeah. It's sometimes called like high level emulation, where I'm not necessarily emulating GameCube, I'm emulating Nintendo's like common toolchain formats. Basically, a lot of the Nintendo games use one or two different common formats of model and like animation data. So like Galaxy and Wind Waker both use a format for their models called the BMD, which I think just stands for binary model. They just name things whatever they want. Because they don't have to care. It's their tool, their engine, right?
Right.
So I just implemented BMD once in NoClip, and then I can support Galaxy and Galaxy 2 and Wind Waker and Twilight Princess and, Sunshine, Pikmin 2, all of these different games that piggyback off that format.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that, like, everything is captured in that format, because there is stuff like lighting data, which tends to differ between games. How different games do lighting is very different. Galaxy's system is no way like Wind Waker's, and I have not even looked at, like, a lot of the more complicated lighting in Twilight Princess, so that game looks a little bit not as accurate, unfortunately. It's not as doesn't look as good as the game should, in my opinion. That's just because I have not spent the time digging into Twilight Princess's code and, like, finding the game-specific engine settings that it has.
Right.
So,
and that's no small feat. Like, I can imagine.
I mean, well, yeah, we got super lucky because in some cases they left debugging data on the game disks for, like, Galaxy, Sunshine, and some of the Zelda games. So we don't necessarily know exactly how the game works, but we have, like, a lot of their internal names for things. Doesn't mean they're easy to decipher, because a lot of them are, like, Japanese programmer English, which is not, like, how we would call things. My favorite is in one of the games. It's common in code to want to compare, like, if a number is higher or lower, and we usually in English say greater than or less than another number, but we specifically, they called it greater and littler, which I find funny, but also just, like, honestly, I like that better.
Yeah.
It's less awkward
cute.
than less than. It is cute. It's usually, I think it's because we usually abbreviate it as GT for greater and less than LT. And they just said, like, LT, that must be littler. So yeah, it's probably way too much of a tangent, but
no, you're fine.
Hopefully that was,
so you've been interpreting these processes and then emulating them as they occur on disk, which I can imagine for people who, like me, who have not gotten very deep into the technical side of how a program runs on a console, is kind of strange that you can just take a lighting function that occurs on a disk that's meant for a very specific piece of hardware and then generalize it so it works on browser.
Yeah, so for the two games that I've worked on the most, which are Super Mario Galaxy and Wind Waker, I often just, like, this is probably not kosher, but I take, like, large parts of their code and I analyze it and I just do the same thing that the game would do. So I'm looking at the actual, functions and game code that runs and translating that over so it can run in the browser. You have to, so the original game code was written in a programming language called C++. That doesn't work on the browser, so I have to basically manually translate it over to a language called JavaScript, which is what browsers all run. So yeah, NoClip is written in JavaScript, and it has, for Wind Waker and Galaxy at least, it has a lot of the game-specific code that's been ported over, or as much as I've bothered to.
Right.
I went on, like, a spree, like, 6 months ago, just, like, taking all the different, like, NPCs and actors and just, like, porting them over one by one, which is just, like, a super, I mean, for me, it's, like, super fun downtime of just, like, being able to just, like, code up these little things and just, like, see them move around and see them behave. And you often get, like, a very good insight to, like, how Nintendo sees a seagull, for instance. You're like, oh, this is what the seagull does in, like, Sunshine, or in Galaxy? I had no idea the seagull was programmed like this.
Yeah.
And they often just use a lot of weird tricks to get stuff to work. And I mean, for me, that's super fun. For anyone else, that's probably torture.
Right. But I guess that's testament to NoClip is like a passion project for you, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
How did all this idea start? Like, how did you come up with the idea to bring all of this to the internet?
Yeah, so honestly, for whatever reason, I've always had just a weird fascination with doing weird things in a web browser. I don't know why. I just like the constraints that it gives. I mean, those who know super old to me, I grew up with Flash, like making Flash games. So I think I was always attached to that sort of environment. And when, Flash died, I switched over to JavaScript and web stuff. So I first, I was working on this one tool called, super old tool by a bunch of other community members called the BMD View, which was, like, the first real, it was a desktop tool, and, like, it could barely get things to work. And I just decided as a fun project to just learn some stuff, learn how it worked. I would just take it and port it to the web for some reason. And that was bmdview.js, and it's very inaccurate. It's still sort of up there if you want to go look at it. But again, it's slow and buggy and doesn't have animations and any of that. And I just had this fascination. So if you're actually curious, like the directory on disk for noclip.website is actually called nitro_bmd. And that's because the first game I ever implemented it was Super Mario 64 DS, which uses, it was on a system, the Nintendo DS was codenamed the Nitro, so all in the code of like Super Mario 64 DS is just the word Nitro everywhere. And they also just reused the word, they reused the name, file extension .bmd for binary model, even though it's a completely different file, completely different format. So I started with Super Mario 64 DS, and then I think I got like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time in there somehow, based on some other code that some other people had written. Like I just sort of took what they did, not knowing what I was doing, and shoved it in a web browser. And I think pretty soon after that, I like wanted to get BMD view in there again, and I just started doing it. And I just sort of had this up. It was just called like a model viewer. I just had it like Jasper's Model Viewer was like the original name of the project. And at some point, I just sort of worked on this and put it aside. And at some point I came back to it. I had come in a situation where like I had a way more free time. And I'm like, I'm going to go play around with this some more.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really want to give this its own website and its own like domain name, its own brand. And I like tossed around a few ideas with a friend, and they're like, godmode.computer. I remember being like one of the suggestions, and I just said noclip.website, and everyone in the chat was like, that's it. You have to buy that domain now. That's how I got it. I think .website is pretty whimsical of an extent, like a domain extension. So I was like noclip.website. It's just fun to say. It's goofy. But yeah, I worked on it for quite a long time at this point. And at some point, it used to be more of a model viewer. It used to have like more games. At some point, I realized like some of these things were so well constructed that I really wanted to turn it less into like a model viewer and more into like a museum of like actually curated working stuff. And so I realized like these games, these artists are way too talented. The stuff they do is way too good to simply be reduced to a model viewer. I want to get like actual games and accuracy in here. I think that like happened after I got animation in there. It's surprising how much animation adds.
Yeah, the fact that animations work in all of these all of these areas that you can view on NoClip, I absolutely agree. That's what makes it spring to life. If you don't mind me sharing an anecdote about that.
Go ahead, please.
One of my first interactions with NoClip was realizing that it has the areas from Pikmin 2, which is my favorite game. It's just absolutely, bar none, my favorite game. And so, like, getting to view the Awakening Wood, I had seen it pop up on different model viewing. I had seen the model pop up before, but to see it with all the textures already applied, all of the shading already applied, and the beams of sunlight coming down that had this weird like reversing animation on them, that is the Awakening Wood. That's the essence of the area. And like that was such a wave of nostalgia for me when I saw that it's fantastic. And museum is an apt term to describe it. I had never thought about it that way, but it is like placing these areas authentically and with the idea that they're there for appreciation. And it's so weird to think that these games that you're pulling from that were mainly about the gameplay and giving people like immediate access to controls and fast gameplay, learning how to play this game quickly. Like, it's still kind of strange and kind of beautiful how these games that are meant to be all about gameplay, all about getting you into the fray, giving you the controls, giving you simple controls, and like all of the design being based off of the gameplay. It's so strange that we come out with set pieces for that kind of game that end up being this beautiful and this, like, lovingly created. You would think that if you have a game that's all about the gameplay, then the aesthetic is kind of secondary.
I mean, I would say that a big influence on Nintendo's game design methodology has always been about exploring. Like, Shigeru Miyamoto, in multiple interviews, has said, like, the things that he likes are, like, horseback riding and, like, exploring caves as a child, and, like, he maintains, like, a bonsai garden, which is, like, this very intentional, like, square thing that you curate and has so many nooks and crannies and places to build and explore.
Right.
I guess bonsai garden is not the right word. It's one of those, like, sand gardens. I forget the proper term. I might have a bonsai garden, too. I don't know. But, like, I suspect that they really do think about space and, like, the player's relationship to the space as, like, core to their gameplay ethos.
Yeah.
And I think that you can see that, like, every time they build a level, they think not just about, like, how the player is going to navigate through it, like, in a straight line, but, like, how the player is going to go off the beaten path.
Right.
And just try and, you know, do that. And I think, like, Pikmin 2 is a great example of, like, it has, like, all these little nooks and crannies. It has so many intricate little places to explore.
Yeah.
That's why I think, like, a no-clip is just a good fit for Nintendo games in general. I mean, well, partly because, I mean, they match the tech, but just, you know, I've written the GameCube thing once. But just, I feel like they have this core ethos that's built into everything they do that's just about exploring.
Yeah.
And I just feel like no-clip really helps bring that appreciation more to life. Maybe that's a little bit self-centered, but...
every level is like a playground, and as such, every corner of it has to look good.
Yeah.
Because they assume that, yeah, that's a good way to think of it. They assume that you're going to see any corner of it. In Pikmin, of course, they push that because, at least in the first two iterations, it's not really about a linear path.
Yeah.
There's multiple ways to get to the objects that you need to get to. And honestly, the areas could be arranged in many different ways and still have you explore them fully.
Absolutely,
which is what they did. Like, in Pikmin 1, you have these 5 different areas to explore, and then in Pikmin 2, a lot of them are reimagined. The same model is used, but just things are placed differently, textures are updated, and lighting is updated.
Right.
And that's really cool. Across 2 games like that, you have these playgrounds.
Yeah.
That, even arranged differently, still facilitate amazing play.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely something worth appreciating in a museum-like format.
Absolutely. And I mean, I will also say, like, as a testament to this, one of the most popular maps, I have not spent as much time as I've wanted to on it, but people really love Woohoo Island from Wii Sports Resort.
Yeah.
And they've mentioned multiple times building that island intentionally as, like, kind of to just really build it out as a playground to really be explored. They didn't really do a lot with it, unfortunately, I think. And it was very inspired by a super old game on the Nintendo 64 called Pilot Wing 64. I think a lot of their ideas about playgrounds and building interesting spaces. I mean, there's a direct lineage from Pilot Wing 64's islands to Woohoo Island, I think. They use a lot of the same tricks and a lot of the same building methodologies. But, like, you're never really given a chance to explore outside of just, I think at the end of the game you unlock, like, a plane ride, where you can go and, like, sightsee, and, like, all these little things pop up saying, like, here's the lighthouse in 1776, you know, this lighthouse was used for this, just little world building bits. And it's really, really nice. I mean, it's not what you expect from a Wii Sports sequel, but I mean, I really, really liked what they did. And I think it is just show, like, just as a testament to, like, how important they think about these things and giving players interesting play spaces to really dig into.
And then giving you, like, the optimal way that they can think of to explore that space.
Right.
Every space is absolutely calibrated for the way that you move around it.
And I will also say, like, another big thing, I don't know how, like, this is more dropped from their design now, but I think a lot of the older Mario games, even like, Mario 64, they just had fantastic overworld hubs to play around in. No challenge, right? Peach's castle does not have a single enemy in it. I guess unless you count, like, the boos in the courtyard. or like maybe like the fire that's hanging on the wall of the underground basement. But like, that is just so much fun to just move around. And clearly, like, I don't think many games had done like a hub world in that sense before, but it like definitely influenced the rest of the platformer genre. I'm quite sure it was like I remember seeing a talk or something by one of the developers of Halo who said like they were extremely influenced by Mario 64's hub world. They're like, we need to like go away from like this and like, you know, build this wide open space where people can just have fun. So like, I think that they think about that a lot. Even Mario World, or even like Mario 3, like they had interesting overworlds with their own character and own secrets, and own exploration, right? It's not just like a linear path like the first two Super Mario Brothers games. They just started adding like, I don't know how, when, who came up with that, but it's just an interesting idea to have like build secrets into the level select. That's not really appreciated for what it is.
Definitely.
Anyway, probably we've got a lot of questions here.
Yeah. I suppose we can start getting into the questions.
No worries.
But definitely, like, please go check out noclip.website and like maybe even like use it while we're talking about these videos that you've made, because it's just wonderful to explore those areas, especially like while listening to either music or definitely listening to people talk about it.
I also forgot to mention at the beginning of the video, but I'm probably going to have visuals going throughout the video. I might have to like edit a little snippet.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so if you're tabbed away, like I might have some interesting footage of like NoClip right here, put in some like Wind Waker here or something, who knows. But certainly for some of the questions, I'm going to have like actual visuals prepared, and I'll try and call that out when I can.
Now, that reminds me, during your video about Wind Waker, which I think we'll get to first, you had a moment where you were describing normals, vertex normals on a model. You had Link on the screen, and you had all of the vertices on Link sprout their own little arrow to show the vertex normal. And like, that is extremely difficult to accomplish. It would be like impossible with just video editing tricks.
Oh yeah.
So first question is about whether that's a product of NoClip, if you used some like custom tools there to build that visual.
Yeah. So the Wind Waker visuals, I just had like some really terrible hacky code that I worked up. Like I recorded the VO, I like timed out all the segments, and I like literally just had in the code like at 3 seconds in, scale up the normals, at 5 seconds in, put the wireframe on. I can't remember the actual order.
Yeah.
But like it was just this really awful code that I wrote, and you know, I wrote a little code to like make an arrow model and pull that in and scale it up and down. And I think the one editing thing that I did was basically just like the sun that like moves around is literally just like an After Effects brush texture or something that I just like
Gotcha.
mildly get looking like the places that I put them. But yeah, the rest of it is NoClip. Funny story, like that video had a super long production process, as you can imagine. So if you like go back, you can actually like look at the different shots of visuals, and you'll just notice like different things appear and disappear. Like trees just show up in one of the shots. That's just because at some point, like I just added trees to NoClip. So like that shot now is trees, whereas the ones before it just don't. I shouldn't say I added trees to NoClip. Completely by coincidence, someone who followed me on Twitter just like DM'd me and said like, hey, I implemented trees in NoClip, and I'm like, oh, that's cool. So like and they didn't even know I was working on a Wind Waker video. They just like did a lot of Wind Waker reverse engineering and like submitted it to me. So that was like a fun coincidence. So yeah, thank you, that person. They got me like interested in actually reverse engineering the game and trying to actually figure it out.
Yeah.
So it was just a fun coincidence. Like that led to like a substantial improvement of accuracy in Wind Waker, to the point where you can actually see like the little wind line that sort of like goes around in the map sometimes. In some of the shots, like some of them are super old and they don't have that, and the other ones are like, there's a little wind line here that's just sort of popping around. That's all done in like the engine and code. That's not like a model or anything. So I had to like manually write the code to like animate that wind line over.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. A lot of the weather in general is hard coded. Like, it's not like a file format on disk. Like they actually had like pretty much wrote all the code from scratch to render like rain and thunder and all this stuff. So I just like take that and port that over. But yeah, it's all built in NoClip. Really convenient because like I can just take it and mess around with it until I get something I like.
Right, yeah. That's fantastic. It's like the future of video game analysis videos.
Yeah. I mean, people are already using it for like cinematography. Like I get some like requests from popular YouTubers being like, "Oh, I use this in a video," or like I'll just like be watching a random YouTube essay and just see like, "Oh, I know those like camera speed settings. That's NoClip."
Yeah.
It's always like a fun thing when I just see it out in the wild.
Yeah. On the heels of talking about that Wind Waker video, let's actually delve into what process you were talking about, which is how Wind Waker creates its cel shading on characters. And you boil it down to a 3-step process, where first the model is vertex lit, and then a texture called ZAtoon is applied to that vertex lighting to make it look more like toon shading. And then the third step is that this custom color palette is filtered onto that toon shading, depending on where Link is, depending on the time of day, depending on the weather. And this whole process creates this iconic toon shading look. And there's a lot of questions that rise out of this process.
Yeah.
Because you explained it really well in the video, but I'm sure that there are a couple of under-the-hood details that go a little further.
Absolutely, yeah, there's so much depth to everything.
Yeah. So let me start with the first part of the process, where the model is given vertex lighting.
Yep.
Which is a process that preceded more modern lighting techniques, but it still involves a light source. And this first question is, like, how exactly can a light source exist in the game? Is it like an object or a texture, or is it its own class of thing in the game? Like, what exactly is this light source?
So this is a surprisingly deep question with many answers, just depending on like if we're talking about the GameCube in specific or talking about like modern lighting techniques. Ultimately, in sort of graphics that we have today, we basically break all lights into 3 rough kinds. We have directional lights, which are basically all light rays are parallel to just a direction. So they just come from somewhere, like the top right or the top left or the bottom right or something like that. And this is just basically the sun. The sun is a sphere and the Earth is a sphere, but they're so far away that the light rays that actually show up on Earth are effectively parallel. The distances involved are so massive that like they're just basically exactly parallel. Or like it's like fractions of millimeters that like you have this arc. So in games we just assume that like the sun is infinitely far away and light rays come parallel into it. So that's a directional light. And basically what that means is it's sort of its own thing, and it's just a couple of math expressions, right? If we're just testing whether a normal faces the light, we're just testing whether those directions face each other. So really, like, in terms of a directional light's just a direction. It's just 3 numbers representing like the direction of light in, you know, X, Y, and Z. It usually has some other settings like color for some reason, for fun reasons. Or I guess the light color in general is something you want to do. In Wind Waker, they can't use that because they have their own color palette system.
Right.
Fun facts, if you want a fun visual, I was considering doing this as like a clickbaity title, but all of the lighting in Wind Waker is actually on the red channel. So the sunlight is actually fully red. So yeah, I was like at some point planning to do like a clickbaity title with like a, you know, visual boy looking red filter over it.
Right.
Like, yeah, Wind Waker only has red light, ? A giant arrow pointing to Link's face or something. Shock expression. But yeah, like that's just technically how they did it. For fun reasons, they actually have a second light source, which is on the green channel, but it's pretty rare. It's used by like treasure chests when you open them and like some lanterns. It's called the effect light. It's basically an orange tint that they can add to certain models.
Gotcha.
And not every model has it. Link, I don't even think receives the effect light, so I just sort of ignored that. But yeah, like they set up the primary light, the P light, on the main channel, and the effect light or EF light on the green channel. And then they also have some cases, so if you have like you're standing next to a lantern, they'll use what's called a point light. And a point light is slightly different because it is not a direction, it's a physical location in space that sort of has like a size and a radius. So it has a few more numbers, right? It has the position in space and like how big it is. And usually a few tweaks, like how, like as you get farther and farther away, like a lamp in the real world just sort of eventually, spreads off and loses effectiveness, loses intensity. So there's the few numbers to control like that curve, right? It's usually called the attenuation curve, distance attenuation curve. And there's also a type of light called spotlights, which are basically point lights, but they cast a circle on the ground. They have like an angle check as well as a distance curve.
Yeah.
But those are, I don't even think those are used in Wind Waker, so we can kind of just ignore them. But the Game Gear hardware did support them.
Interesting.
So yeah, they are completely their own class of object, and they're not really, models or textures. They're kind of, well, in some ways they're just tools. They're just math expressions.
Right. On that note, actually, that would mean that it is the actual vertices and their normals that are determining how bright they are, and not necessarily like any point in space that is casting light rays onto the object. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. It depends on, like, you can boil it down to math, and you can build any visual you want on top of that math, right? All we have is sort of the direction check, is this facing the place where the sun would be.
Yeah.
And you can imagine it as an object. I mean, the game actually positions a real light object for the sun, and like does the calculation to make the angle correct. But like, though it comes from a point in space, like I think like the sun is just like 80,000 units away or something like that. And they just calculate the angle that it needs to be when they generate the light for the sun.
I see.
Yeah, and I think indoor maps can work differently. If you're not next to like a lantern or like an actual light source in the engine. Yeah, I guess for those who don't remember or haven't seen the video, it's been a while. The actors only have a single light source attached to them. They only like use one. They just pick the one that's closest to them. Yeah. But if you're indoor and there's no light that's closest to them, they just have in the map file like a hard-coded angle. Like, this is just the light direction if you're not close to a lamp.
And it makes artistic sense, I suppose.
Yeah.
If you had multiple lights at once that were all casting this ZAtoon look onto the character, it would be distracting.
It would be a mess, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was clever of them to only pick the closest light.
Yeah.
And that honestly kind of leads you toward that light, doesn't it? If you're like standing close to two lanterns and one of them is actually lighting Link, then it kind of draws you toward that one.
Right, yeah. It's such a weird thing. I don't know how they came up with it, and it's just one of those like weird things that like as a graphics person myself, I just wouldn't imagine just having a single light because it's just so physically wrong.
Right.
So it to me, it's just like, really? They did that? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
and
I guess.
You mentioned that the GameCube could support up to 8 of them at once, didn't it? Yeah, it was definitely deliberate to just go with one.
Although it couldn't support 8 with tune shading because of that like restriction I labeled earlier, where they only really have 2 channels. So it's possible it came out of that restriction.
Gotcha.
But I do kind of think that they chose it intentionally, or they at least did the tech together with the ZAtoon texture, because I do think that they do sort of build that silhouette often intentionally. Yeah.
All right, so that's how firstly a vertex model gets, or a model gets vertex lit. And so it's all the vertices and their normals determining how close they are to facing the light source, and that gives them the brightness. The next question is why it wouldn't be that you calculate face normals instead of vertex normals, because the vertex, as you said in the video, the vertex can't have any normal information unless it's connected to other vertices.
Yeah.
So, like, with a little math, you could use face normals instead and have less normals to deal with.
In theory, yeah. I mean, so for those who don't know, I'm probably gonna have some visuals on the screen to explain it. There's So there's a few different things here. The first is you totally can just calculate the normals. If you have like a mesh like that and you run it through like Blender or 3ds Max, you can totally just like ask it to like average all the vertices around it and like give you an outward direction. And modelers will do that. For various reasons, we don't do that at runtime. First is that it's actually surprisingly hard to take a mesh like that and figure out which way is pointing inside and which way is pointing outside. Because if you can imagine, you can just like take a mesh and remove one vertice and then build like a giant like bubble around it that goes all the way around. And now the inside is the outside, the outside is the inside. So if you're just looking like a point on the face and you just remove a vertex on the feet and like build a bubble around it, you don't have to like go all the way down to the feet to figure out whether you're inside or outside. And so usually modelers, even like 3D modelers, they'll have, some amount of like algorithms and ways to try and detect whether you're inside or outside, but they can still get it wrong. And I'm sure that everyone who has used a 3D tool has had to hit the flip normals button.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
all
just
the time.
Because their algorithms are, they try and work 90% of the time, but like that's not good enough. So it's very difficult to compute normals in real time. And so we mostly just don't try. We just sort of say the artist has full control over the normal. The second thing that you totally could do is you could just take the triangle itself and just say, instead of, having the vertice face out, you just have the triangle obviously knows which way it faces. And you could totally do that. That's a valid choice, but you'll have this faceted look where, it's not a wrong look. There are a lot of games that do this. I think the most recent example I can think of is an indie game called Super Hot, which has like these very faceted, crystal-looking characters.
Yeah.
That's what you would get if you used face normals, because you don't have any of that smooth blending between normals that usually the hardware would give you. Every triangle has its own normal, and so you can see the triangles a lot more readily.
Yeah.
And there's a few other reasons as well why we want artists to have control over normals. I don't know if everyone has seen the pretty infamous GDC talk by the developers of Guilty Gear XRD, one of the tech artists on it, where they go over like a big part of their vertex and toon lighting look. They actually like manually tweak the vertex normals to point in certain directions so that they get the exact silhouette they need.
Oh, interesting.
Which is remarkably clever. Like pretty much all, like they have like an example that they show, and all the vertex normals of the face are like pointing completely up and to the right in the same direction. So they could just like sculpt the shadow they want, which is fascinating to me. And they mentioned like that was just such a huge part of their look that they needed the extra control.
Yeah.
So there's various reasons why we can't compute them at real time, and then why we might not even want to, even if we could. Why face normals, could work. It'll just give you a different look. These are all tools that you can mix and match.
Right. I'm pretty sure they're available in most like 3D modeling applications. Like in Blender, it just calls it smooth shading for vertex normals and flat shading for flat face normals. So I guess that's you would only want that if you were going for something faceted or something with a lot of flat surfaces, like I don't know, a crate or something like that. Yeah.
So a good example would be anything with a hard edge, you want face normals on it. But anything that like is smooth, we can't have curves in 3D graphics. We can only have flat triangles. So we emulate or like try and fake curves by having the smooth normals fake the lighting.
Right. All right. So that's everything about how these models get vertex lit, and that applies this smooth shading to them that makes them look like 3D curved surfaces.
Yeah.
But then we apply the step that the artists wanted, because they didn't want this to look like a smooth surface. They wanted it to look like a cartoonish surface. So this texture called ZAtoon is applied. Firstly, like, why a texture? Is it like, why not an array of values or like a lookup table or something?
Several people I think mentioned like, why not smoothstep? Why not a lookup table?
Yeah.
Ultimately, the GameCube doesn't have smoothstep. That's for those who are unaware, it's like a function that we can use on modern GPUs. That just didn't exist. The way that you would do smoothstep is just a texture. And similarly, a lookup table and a texture are kind of equivalent, at least on the GameCube. This is the only way you have to do this. In fact, the feature here that does like the vertex lighting to color palettes or whatever, is actually pretty specific. Like, it specifically calls out, like, you have to have 256 values, or your texture has to be 256 pixels wide. It just won't work otherwise.
Right.
So it is like a weird special case of the hardware. It's not like a usual texture. It's just a weird thing that the GameCube has. It just because it just doesn't have lookup tables or, you know, modern things like smoothstep.
Right.
So yeah.
It's certainly, like, more accessible that way, I would say, because there's a visual reference for how this effect is going to look. So I can imagine that this kind of process, using a texture for an effect like this, is done pretty often in GameCube games.
Oh yeah.
I can, like, throw out some prominent examples, but would you happen to have anything that comes to mind that is similar to a process like this?
I mean, displacement maps, I think, are another example of, like, a texture that isn't a texture. It's a texture that just has, like, here's how much you shift around this pixel. And I guess, like, environment maps are kind of similar. I mean, it's not an exact match. Yeah.
That was kind of what I was thinking of. It's like, it is used to visually represent an object, and it's coloring the object, but it's not mapped to an object. It's, like, mapped to a reflection of that object.
Absolutely, yeah.
Or, like, specularity maps.
Yes.
Like, that is normally not done with vertex lighting, as far as I can tell.
But there's a lot of things that they do with, like, just grayscale textures. They do so much with grayscale textures. Yeah. Either used to, I mean, another example I can think of is, like, the Sunshine has the paint, right? There's a lot more that goes into how the paint system works, but at the end of the day, it's just a giant texture that gets put onto the ground. And, like, when you spray water, it's actually just like painting, just like kind of just like in paint in like MS Paint or Photoshop, just like taking little brush textures that it has and just splatting them on, stamping them on the thing, and then that's used as a grayscale alpha texture, alpha map for the entire rest of the material. So, like, they'll do stuff like that a lot. Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to, like, separate that out. There's a wonderful little tiny thing. I think it's on Super Mario Galaxy 2, and you could just, like, look around this. It's just like a tiny little rock, and you mentioned specularity maps. You can't do proper specular on the GameCube hardware, but if you just go through this and, like, slightly try and, like, turn the camera around this little tiny rock, you will just see, like, specular come in and out, and it's a combination of environment maps and, like, mask textures, and it is just masterful crafting for, like, a whole video could be made on the material of this rock and, like, the fundamental theory behind it. And they just do this everywhere. I mean, I think a big part of Galaxy's aesthetic is how it deals with shiny objects.
Yes.
I mean, right behind you and sort of on the other side of that giant question mark block, you also have the giant coin from the Super Massive Galaxy, which is also a masterpiece in material design, in my opinion. There's so much to love here, but I'll just leave it at that and say, like, yeah, this is using so many of those kind of, you know, grayscale image map effects to layer them all together, right, to really make something shine and have texture. So yeah, and you could even see, I think on this one, just to give you an example, you can see on this rock some of the faceted face normals that we were talking about. Like, it uses vertex lighting, as you can see, but, like, it's very intentionally set to face normals so that you get that nice faceted look. Yeah. So for anyone who didn't go Google super hot or something, there you go.
So yeah, even with modern, like, shader graphs, for example, that's still kind of a method that we're following, where we use textures that do not make it into the final color of the object, but are giving information to the object.
Absolutely.
And that was being done back on the GameCube. You just needed a exactly square texture.
Oh yeah.
So that's fascinating. That really is. And then that's not even the final step. So this texture gets applied to the vertex lighting to make it harsher. Not perfectly harsh. It still has this, like, little bit of softness to it, which I really admire.
Yeah.
And after that, you have palettes. So a light palette and a shade palette that are applied to this model to get it to look more like the color of the environment. Or to fit in the color of the environment, I should say.
Yeah.
And You made the surprising observation that all of these palettes are hand-picked, which blew my mind. That is an amazing amount of control that the artists have over that environment.
Yeah. It's so good. It's really clever. I think for anyone who's like into graphics, like you just don't expect the places where Nintendo gives artists control. Really, it's like anyone who makes modern games, like really? Oh, okay.
Right. But at the same time, you can imagine that adds a lot of time to creating or to look development in all of these places.
Oh, yeah.
So here's a question about that. Like, wouldn't it have been possible to generate all these palettes via rules, as you suggested in the video? Like, there were ways that you could define one color and then perform a process to get to the other color. And that would make it a lot faster to choose all these colors. And then, like, make tweaks in there manually. Like, what is the advantage of choosing all of these colors?
So, I mean, there totally is, and I can't say for certain how these colors were picked. It's possible that an artist used a tool or like a color picker in Photoshop or something like that to just generate all these colors, right? Nothing says that you can't just have a tool that runs over and generates sort of a base thing and then they tweak it manually. That I would honestly, if I was doing this today and had, 1,000 different things to color in manually, I would do that, right? I might. It's all about how much control you do have versus how much control you give away. And as I mentioned, like, so the toon lighting, some of this toon lighting stuff goes back to the 90s. There's a paper from, I think, 1989 or 1990, where they talk about basically kind of, I mean, it's designed for different hardware, so it's not exactly the same process, but they talk about this, and the way that they recommend you choose the colors is with just some lighting math. They recommend you pick like a highlight and a shadow color with just some basic lighting math, and they go over in the paper how to generate the two colors. That's what I think like a lot of other games back then did. They just didn't pay any attention to it. So I think it's completely valid to generate something from a tool and then stick those colors into the game.
Yeah.
It's just the question is whether the engine is generating those colors or whether you have the ability to go in and tweak them.
Right.
And I think that is the subtle step. Certainly, if I was doing this today, I would write a tool that gives me like good results 90% of the time, and then just tweak the ones that I need to. I think Nintendo traditionally has been a little bit labor heavy. They did a talk on Breath of the Wild's like development, and they talked about like all these like wonderful things that they found, like like placing like all this ambient sound triggers for for the giant map was exhausting. Like we gave up after doing like the plateau. We're just gonna write like a script to do it. And they sort of like told this to the audience as if this was this giant revelation. And the audience was sitting there going like, yeah, how else would you do it? So like, I think they're a little bit behind with like automating this sort of stuff and generating tools, making tools to generate these things. And certainly from what I've seen of Japanese game development, it's all spreadsheets. Like pretty much everything is spreadsheets. So it would not surprise me if some artist had to go in like an Excel spreadsheet and like declare all the colors manually, copy them over.
Gotcha.
But yeah, I mean, you could totally write a tool to do it. And if you're doing this for yourself, please do. Please don't think you have to generate all these palettes manually.
Right. Yeah. It's much more cost and time effective that way.
Absolutely.
So all of these colors got chosen nonetheless. And then I wanted to ask, like, how exactly the colors are applied to the ZAtoon texture. Like, are they some sort of color filter? Like you find in an art program, or is it multiplying light?
I assume, by the way, what you're talking about is not the ZAtoon texture that comes after or that comes before. It's like Link's texture, right? Like the green.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just go into some basic lighting theory, right? Like, as you probably remember from middle school or high school physics, light just comes from a source, right? It comes out as photons or waves. Argue about that in the comments section, please. And like, what you probably remember is like some amount of light gets like absorbed into the object as heat, right? Which is why wearing a black shirt is a lot harder, makes you a lot hotter than wearing a white shirt, and some amount of light gets reflected. And so if you have a material that reflects 70% of the light that it gets received, and you have like 1,000 photons hitting it, you will receive, it'll reflect 700 photons and absorb the rest of the other 300. So what that comes down to is like ratios, and it just comes down to a multiplication. And we typically, I won't get into depth, but we do this separately for red, green, and blue for various reasons. We don't have full wavelength spectrum analysis or anything like that. We just have like red, green, and blue channels. And so we say like 70% of the, 30% of the red channel is reflected back, 70% of the green channel is reflected back. And that's effectively what the Link's texture actually is saying. It's saying, if I was hit by a fully bright white light, I am going to reflect back 70% of the green and 20% of the red, or whatever the values are for Link's distinctive green tunic. And that's what that's saying. And when you look at the color values and see like they're 255, you should think of that not as like a value between 0 and 255, but kind of a value between 0 and 100%, 0% and 100% of how much light is going to be reflected, which makes sense kind of, think about it, like during the night, there is less red and green light because they want to push more of the blue of the moon. So the red and green channels sort of get pushed down, and you see more blue light reflecting off of Link's tunic, mixed with, the high percent of green. So it's sort of a blue-green mix, and red goes down. I'm just sort of imagining what it is, but it's basically ratios and multiplication. And Wind Waker doesn't have multiple color sources, as we mentioned, but if you were to have one, if I just put two lights next to each other, one's emitting 1,000 photons, the other's emitting 3,000 photons, these numbers are completely, like, there are millions of photons around me right now. Like, I'm just choosing easy numbers for easy numbers.
Yeah.
Like, those just get added together. There are now 4,000 photons that an object is receiving. So it's kind of just really convenient that the rules of lighting just boil down to addition and multiplication, which is surprisingly simple. I mean, it's partially we sort of simplified a lot of the more complex math of, quantum electrodynamics down into addition and multiplication. Right. But it's still like a surprisingly good approximation, and we do that today. And so much we could go into. I mean, any one of these topics you can say, like, how does that work at the physical level? Or, like, what is your eye seeing? Go into, like, color vision research, which is a whole...
Right.
So much depth to pretty much anything. Yeah.
Not only do they boil this down to an addition multiplication process, but they boil it down to 2 addition multiplication processes rather than several more in a more smoothly cinematically lit environment. You just have 2 because you only have the light color and the shadow color that you have to determine.
Basically. I should say, like, none of this is Nintendo's thing. We've been doing stuff like this for a while. But yeah, like, it's nice that just the rules of lighting just boil down to very simple operations.
Yeah.
I didn't bother going into color mixing because I guess I just didn't think about it when I was doing the video. I just sort of figured everyone knew it. But yeah, no, that's it. That's all it is. Blending 2 colors like that. I mean, that's also one of the things that I should say is, like, when we started looking more deeply at, computer graphics and lighting, we had to rethink like what a texture meant. And so one definition we came up with was, if I'm hit by this much light, I will reflect this much light back. That was sort of a new definition that we sort of came up with in the 2010s. I won't go into the whole details of physically based rendering, but that was a methodology and sort of a mental shift to cause us to rethink, like, what is a texture really? And how does it really interact with light, to really push the boundaries of, what computer graphics could do.
Right.
And it's a really fascinating subject to me that, like, we had to recontextualize how they think about a texture and, like, what is a color even.
These are the questions you end up asking in a career in lighting.
Yeah.
What is a color? What is a texture?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that, like, as simple as they seem, like, these are the deep philosophical questions that really get to the heart of it.
Yeah.
And when you're doing something as fundamental as trying to simulate the world around us, you do need to dig deep. It's not easy to ask what is a color really.
Right.
And I'm sure that, like, for those of us who do remember, like, the first time that we were in middle school or high school class, we learned about, like, objects don't have color. They just sort of reflect and absorb things. Everyone was like, what? That doesn't make any sense. It is. And it took us thousands of years as a human society to figure that out, right? It's not easy stuff.
Yeah. and yet we still use the language that something is orange or something is purple rather than reflects orange or reflects purple, because there's like there's a certain characterization to that.
Yeah.
Like all of the, getting back to just Wind Waker, all of the models and objects in this game are all created toward telling a story.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Bringing out a game. So like it makes sense that we think about color in terms of an object having that color,
right?
Because that suits the story of this game.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it's fascinating that they're being so. It stands to reason, therefore, that they are so deliberate with their color choices, because this is a very visually dynamic and popping game.
Yeah.
Where all of the colors are suited toward telling this story. And that's something you see. Sorry,
I know, I'm trying to get words in here. I mean, obviously you keep talking, but I just want to say, like, I think that a lot of Wind Waker, or I sort of classify, people are going to hate on me in the comments, but I classify the different Zelda games, people have like tier lists, but I just think of them as like Wind Waker is very exploration and curiosity focused. It's a game that you see something out of the distance and you go, I want to figure out what that is.
Yeah.
And I think color and scale are underutilized as storytelling mechanisms. I mean, I think that like seeing something big in the distance that's fogged away is just intensely curious.
Yeah. That makes me think of Journey.
Oh, what a good game.
Yeah.
And just to put something in front of the player, I think that like there are things that we have not explored in terms of game design, in terms of like how color really impacts someone's curiosity, and how scale does as well. I think that those are just two wonderful things that we just need to explore more of.
Yeah,
in games.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that that still leads back to another question about Wind Waker. A very important object in this game, both in color and in scale, is the ocean. It's like it colors the whole game, or at least half of the game, this beautiful shade of blue. It's immense. It goes on seemingly forever, like it ends at the horizon, and it even fades slightly into the sky. And then you've got like the little ripples and foam texture underneath you, and then as it fades into the distance, those become just like these cartoonish triangular waves, and like the whole thing just grips you. It beckons exploration. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about how the ocean got its look.
Oh man, so I want to say like what a it's I mean, for how mechanically intricate it is, how many moving parts there are to make that happen, it's surprisingly smooth. Even on no clip, it's hard to emulate because there are things the game does to make the ocean work that I can't just do if you can free cam. to give like a specific example, so the way that the ocean kind of works is that the game doesn't want to simulate a full ocean, obviously, so it just simulates a small area around the player. It just sort of builds like a little tiny box around the player where all the waves happen, and then the distance, it just renders basically a flat surface all the way out to the edges of the map when it can, which we'll get into. It uses fog to blend in with the skybox. There's actually a piece of the skybox, if you look at it separately, called the false sea, which is basically colored the same as the fog color, so as the ocean fades out into the distance, it just blends naturally into this false sea.
Right.
So that's going on. That's like the main thing. When you get close to an island, they will basically turn off that, or close to, I would say, an important island. Any island that you can get above ground level on, where you're kind of tall. Outset is one because you can climb up to the top and look at the forest, or like Windfall has the windmill. They basically turn off the entire ocean at that point and only render in the actual map model itself. They have a little fake ocean square. And it's because if they rendered the ocean all the way out to infinity, as soon as you got high enough, you'd actually start to see like clouds dipping below the ocean plane. So they need to hide that. They need to like turn that off. So that means that they need to fade out the little like wavy displacement map looking texture, the ocean waves, and flatten it out so they can bring in this fake island ocean mesh, and then they need to turn on the triangle wave. So it's like very mechanically intricate, so many moving parts and pieces to it, which is just, it's hard to like emphasize how much work had to go into like doing this. And I'm sure like on the development team they were like, oh, how are we going to solve this? We can't like have the players go vertically up. We're just going to have no vertical levels, and they have to really struggle to come up with like, okay, let's just turn the ocean off and then have this fake ocean so that in the distance you can see under the ocean.
Yeah.
So if you go to NoClip today and like mouse around the sea map, you'll actually see the oceans like dipping underneath, or the clouds dipping underneath the ocean plane. It looks very ugly. I've like just tested in the game itself and like used like a fly code, like infinite hover code, and just like went out to a random map square, and yeah, that happens there.
Yeah.
It's like there's just a graphical artifact if you go too high on an island that isn't especially marked. So it's such mechanically intricate in terms of like all the different moving parts that are there. And yeah, the triangle waves, when I was implementing them in NoClip, I found a very fun fact, which is like barely visible in the game, but like the tops of them actually skew to fit the wind. Like if the wind is facing to the left of where the triangle's going, it'll skew it to the left, and if it's going to the right, it'll skew it to the right.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's so many small touches and details. So it's just like, yeah, so much is going on. Oh, and they have like another thing. They have like these triangle waves that show up, and they can show up anywhere. But if they just show up anywhere, they'll like appear in the middle of the island meshes.
Right.
So they actually have to like place like a cylinder trigger box to say like, if the wave like gets inside the cylinder, like just like turn it off, like fade it out, please. And because otherwise you'll just see like the triangle waves just going through the middle of the island. It is just so many moving parts, and it's one of those things where like it's fun because when I was just looking at implementing a NoClip, I had no idea what anything did. I would like implement one part and it just would break, and I'm like, how did they solve this?
Yeah.
And it was just like a process of trying to explore like this massive engine to find out how they solved this specific problem. And eventually I think I found most of them. I can't say I found all of them. There's still a lot of stuff in there. But like it was just like a weird like how did they solve this? How did they solve triangle waves going through islands? So it was just like had to like rediscover all of the tiny little mechanical parts that make it up.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all centered around Link.
Oh yeah. Literally.
That when you mentioned like flying out of using like a fly code to see the ocean out of place, that reminded me a bit of seeing a similar thing happen in Mario Sunshine. And like someone was I can't remember who it was I was watching using this code, but they like flew out of Mario's usual location and got to the edge of this big sphere around Mario that is the cutoff point for like heat waves. Where beyond that, like the environment looks like it's waving in the heat of the day, and that was super fascinating. I had always wondered how they had gotten that to work, and it turns out that it's just like a bunch of shapes that are constantly following the main character, saying that outside of this shape, do all these processes, but don't worry about anything inside because this experience needs to be very contained and run very smoothly.
Yes, yeah, there's so many tiny little details. Ah, man. Yeah, I don't even know where to go from here because I'm like my mind is just like full of like 20 different things that they've done, and I'm like, do I really want to explain all of this?
Well, definitely one thing we can still ask about Wind Waker is a process still dealing with the lighting, the toon shading, which is that in populated islands or islands with a lot of vertical geometry, you get shadows. And these shadows are not like the character shadows, they're a bit more baked onto the landscape. But if you stand in them, the toon shading gets dimmed a little.
Yeah, that was... Yeah. Yeah, no, I noticed when I was editing the video together, I'm like, because I was wondering, like, I mentioned at some point, like, they didn't check for the sun to dim anything down, and I'm like, is my script wrong? So I had to actually go and like figure out how they were doing that. Thankfully, my script wasn't wrong, and I left the video footage in as like a clue to anyone who had found it, because I was curious to see if anyone would spot it and try and call me out on it. But basically, yeah, the way that they trigger that is actually surprisingly clever. There's actually 2 different models for every island. There is the visual model, which you see, and there's just the collision model, which is a very low poly version of that. And the collision model often has not only just like the collision data and the triangles, but it usually has like tags for each triangle, like maybe do something here, or maybe use this camera here. So if you're like on this specific thing, it'll use this camera, or you know, this triangle is actually like the exit room transition triangle. If I'm on this triangle, load the next room. That's actually how they do like doors. The door is not loading the next map transition. The door just takes you behind like the door, and there's just a triangle underneath that says load the next map.
Right.
Kind of janky. Which is why if you like get into, I think speedrunners typically call them loading zones. If you like get behind a door, you can just like enter it and just transition to the map. It's just a weird quirk of how they built the game. And there's actually a specific tag on each triangle that tells it which palette to use. It's a little bit more complicated because not like it works during both like normal and rainy and snowy weather. They actually have another layer on top of that, which is like it's usually used. It's like there's a specific palette for each island on the sea, and I think all of them are actually the same. Like there's maps a 7x7 grid, so there's 49 islands on the sea, and they actually have like 49 entries in this giant, what's called the room palette table. But they're all the same, so I didn't bother mentioning it because I was like, okay, they're all the same. But there's actually a 50th and a 51st entry for it, which is used. So the 51st entry is used for actually shadows. So there's actually 3 more palettes that are there for icy, rainy, snowy weather for shadowed
Right.
geometry. So when you're standing on that collision triangle, it says switch from like the room. Switch from like room 11, which I think is Windfall Island, for instance, to room palette 51, which is the shadowed version. So it's still like an extension of the same system, just sort of jammed in there with just a palette override. And I've actually not figured out what the 50th palette is there. It's in the data, but I've not figured out what, if anything, uses it. There's probably some, I would have to go and like manually search every single collision triangle to see if I can find something that activates the 50th palette, and I have not searched through all the collision data to find it. But I'm curious if anyone wants to go check it out. There are some open source or like fan modding tools for Wind Waker where you can go and actually inspect the collision data.
Yeah.
One of them is called, I think, Winditor by one of my friends works on it. So you can go and like actually open the collision data and go check it out if you want to. And if you find the 50th palette used anywhere, definitely let me know. I'm curious.
Would you say that the collision data is built with shadows in mind then? Are there like triangles that appear to cut out the shape of a shadow so that they can...
I mean, it's mostly used for like awnings and stuff like that. So anywhere under like a shadowed roof, I think they use it. For whatever reason, they didn't use it on the houses on Outset. I don't know if they intentional or an omission. Could just been an accident. They forgot to tag those triangles, or I don't know. Maybe they felt like the sun's not really coming from that direction most of the time, so we're not going to bother. Because it really only makes sense because the sun moves around. It only really makes sense when it's like directly overhead roof.
Yeah.
Right.
That's fantastic. It all comes together, and the fact that it can perform, like do all that and then perform at 30 frames per second. It's
wonderful.
It's amazing. That actually makes me want to ask what you think of the remake of Wind Waker, because we happen to have one, and would you say on first glance, I don't know if you've looked into internally at the remake at all, but would you say that like they're still using that same lighting information?
I have not actually looked too closely at it, but I think a lot of the data was untouched. I've read the Iwata Asks interview where one of the programmers goes into more technical... I mean, I'm surprised both at like how technical the Iwata Asks interviews can get, because sometimes they mention that stuff like, really? That's not something anyone I think would really care to know about. and one of the people that worked on it, who is like my idol. If I was ever to like sit down, like pipe dream, sit down and interview someone at Nintendo, it would be this guy, Takahiro Dota, where like he mentioned in the interview, like he spent like a week getting like Link's eyes to move correctly, and it was like I reread that when working on the video right after I had done the same in NoClip, and I'm just like, yeah, you go, man. You know what I mean? Like, I know exactly the pain you're talking about. I know exactly. This is such a wacky way that they did it. The way they did the eyes is fascinating. I could do a whole video about that because it needs to appear on top of the hair.
Right.
And so the way that they have to like render the eyes so it's on top of the hair, but like still can be obscured by objects in front of Link.
Right. Yeah.
Really weird and really finicky. I'm surprised it works as well as it does. But yeah, like so it's like set up in a really janky way because it basically renders like a mask first and then renders the eyes and then renders another mask to undo the first mask. It's kind of complicated.
Wow.
It's so I imagine when they were like porting it over to the Wii U, like they had to like look into like exactly how like each object was rendered, like all the different like tiny little mask textures, and get those lined up correctly. So like I would just do the same in NoClip. So I'm like, I get your pain, man. I see what you're doing. So I would love to like sit down and interview that guy. That would be. I mean, it's one of those things where like I would love to just go and do it, but like it would never realistically happen, and they probably would not like enjoy the conversation the same way I would, even if it was to happen. So like it's just a fantasy thing. But yeah, Wind Waker HD, getting back to that, two things I'll say. One, no matter what I say, the comment section won't like me. Not that they matter. And two, my opinion really doesn't matter. If you have your own opinions about Wind Waker HD and how you like it, how you don't, fine. I don't totally fine to have your own opinions about things. I will say my opinions. I mean, this is a cop-out answer, but I liked a lot of the things they did, and I didn't like some of the things they did. There's a few tricks that I think they missed when porting it over, which is, I mean, not too surprising because they're very obscure. And I'm half surprised they didn't catch it, but also half surprised they didn't catch it. One of those sentences should have been the other way around. Squint in your head and it'll make sense.
Right.
But yeah, like it's one specific trick, and I feel like they should have done that. Specifically, they use a weird feature of the GameCube hardware, which we might get into, to fade out the ocean texture so it doesn't look too repetitive. And I think they just forgot to notice what it was, because you look at Wind Waker HD, and I think they just forgot to adjust the settings for the HD port. It's a weird technique that relies on the fact that it's a 480p game.
Gotcha.
And when they upgraded to HP, I think they just forgot to tweak the value so that it matched 1080p. So the fade that happens when the ocean gets far into the distance happens way later, so it looks a lot more repetitive, which is unfortunate to say the least.
Experience ruined.
Yeah, right. And it's also weird because that same effect is used for like two more things in the game. One of them is an effect I don't think anybody has ever noticed. It's slightly spoilery. I don't think we mentioned this. You mentioned to me at some point that I don't think you've played Wind Waker.
Yes.
So I don't want to spoil it for you.
Yeah.
I'll put visuals on it.
I too have no strong opinions or connection with this game yet because I haven't played it yet.
Yeah.
Although I think if I were able to choose, I would go with the original over the
original
HD
recipe, yeah.
Because I have definitely developed an appreciation for the lighting processes in that game.
Right. I think everyone's in pretty much agreement that a lot of the gameplay tweaks they made to, especially a lot of the late game stuff, is good, and the fast sail, they added like a fast button basically to the sailing. They couldn't. I think they said they couldn't do that in the original because of like loading time constraints.
Yeah,
but they just sort of just gave you a turbo button for the sailing, which I mean, sure. I think a lot of people like that better. But yeah, I think a lot of people, there was controversy over whether the new aesthetic for the game was good or not. I like most of it.
Right.
I don't think it looks. I think it's a choice. I think there are parts of it they could have maybe toned down a little bit. I think everyone's in agreement. Like, if you've seen some of the screenshots, especially I think in the get item cutscenes, like Link has a very puffy lighting. They sort of turn off the toon lighting. And a lot of people didn't like that. I think it could have been toned down a little bit, but I don't think it's as nearly as bad as people suggest it is.
Yeah.
I had to like look at some Wind Waker HD reference footage. I think I cut the section in the final video, but I was originally gonna have like a section on Wind Waker HD. I looked at some footage for it. The big thing that stuck out to me was they changed the look of the sun. The sun looks very different from the original cartoony look.
Yeah.
The original one has these like these triangular beams that sort of just radiate out, and the new one is like tiny little lines that stick out. It looks very different. I didn't notice it all when I was playing, but I just noticed when I was like going over footage. I was like, oh wow, okay, I guess they changed that one.
Right. I guess I can see why, because the sunlight is very different in that game. It's a lot more. I don't know. It seems to be a bit more physical.
Yeah.
So I guess it stands to reason that they would change the look of the sun as well to try and...
I would also imagine that with the heavy bloom, any sort of sharp triangular shapes didn't come out correctly.
Yeah.
Because they had like a very like very angular sunbeams in the original. And I imagine when they turned on the bloom, it's like, oh well, okay, we gotta fix this. Because you could probably like take a screenshot and like open up Photoshop and like blur it a little bit and see what it looks like. It's not gonna look great, I'll tell you that much.
Right.
So yeah, I imagine there are reasons why they did it, but it's just I kind of understand where people are coming from when they say it's just not the same aesthetic.
Yeah.
It's just whether you like what they did or whether you didn't.
Yeah. All right, so I think that's going to wrap up this part of the Q&A session. That was a lot of amazing information about Wind Waker.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
in the next part, we're going to delve more into the other game that you've covered on video, Super Mario Galaxy.
Yeah.
And that's hopefully going to lead us into a discussion of just other games that we really enjoy and like lighting information about them. It's
absolutely.
It's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. Same here. Just gonna do a little plug here. Please go subscribe to Scruffy. They make some amazing content. I've been subscribed to them for a long time. Actually, I think it was an artist I was working with that sent me your Pikmin 3 model trivia video, which I don't know how you like bringing up like old videos, because like I imagine some of them like you're like, oh, hard to watch, but
that one's okay. That one's on brand.
That one was wonderful. I mean, from the start I knew like, oh, this guy is just really good in presenting things in such a good way, and I'm just like jealous. So thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And yeah, I think we both have Twitter accounts, which we'll put up on the screen if you want to ask us any more questions or argue in the comment section below about whatever.
Definitely.
And yeah, if you guys like this, we're gonna do a few parts, but if you guys like this, we might just turn this more into a regular podcast sort of thing. I mean, assuming you're up for it.
I'd definitely be up for it. Yeah.
It's just wonderful. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
All right. We'll see you in part 2.
Take care.